taught at a school that I went to, so I never had an idea. No, we get I was down so much.
All right, everybody, we're gonna get started here. Thank you to everyone for coming to the second talk in our Connections Experts speaker series. This one is going to be from Grozny to Mariupol, the Chechen Wars and the Future of the North Caucasus. And sitting to my left is Dr. Michael Dennis. Dr. Michael Dennis is currently an adjunct assistant professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and a leading expert on Chechnya, the North Caucasus insurgency, and the Russo-Chechen Wars. In addition to over 20 years of research in the region, Dr. Dennis spent over 5 years living with the Chechen rebels and refugees in the Pankisi Gorge along the Chechen border with the Republic of Georgia, and displaced Chechen communities in Azerbaijan, Belgium, Poland, and Turkey, exploring the conditions under which displaced populations attitudinally support political violence. His postdoc research focused on Chechen attitudes towards foreign fighters in Ukraine and Syria. During the second Russo-Chechen War, he served as a volunteer aid worker with the International Rescue Committee, tasked with leading a team to help rebuild water, sanitation, and education infrastructure in war-torn Chechnya, and provide subsistence support to tens of thousands of Chechen refugees. From 2004 to 2011, he co-directed the Chechnya Advocacy Network, an international humanitarian non-governmental organization created to improve human rights and security in Chechnya, provide legal and asylum procedure assistance for Chechen refugees, and conduct research on issues related to the Russo-Chechen Wars, and raise awareness and funds to improve infrastructure, physical and psychological rehabilitation, and education in the Republic of Chechnya. Dr. Dennis's research has been published in security studies and referenced in foreign affairs, and he recently completed an academic book manuscript based on his decades-long work with Chechen refugees. He holds a PhD in government from the University of Texas at Austin, a master's in political science from Miami University, Ohio, and studied at Novgorod State University in Russia and the University of Cambridge in the UK. He's a former Fulbright scholar and speaks Chechen and Russian. Dr. Dennis, thank you.
Thank you very much. And also omitted from that biography was also a dual major with crises. I have my undergrad also here at the University of Texas. So it's wonderful to be here today. Thank you for having me. I'd also just like to thank the Center for Russian East European Eurasian Studies, the Strauss Center for International Security and Law, the LBJ School, the College of Liberal Arts, the Global Disinformation Lab, and the Department of International Relations and Global Studies. So thank you for hosting me. I do have to begin my talk just with a sort of obligatory, as someone who's worked for the U.S. government. All comments today represent my own, not official U.S. policy. And again, I really appreciate being here. What I wanted to do is sort of to begin by just sort of sharing an introduction of Chechnya. You know, why should we care about Chechnya? It's in the news today, but it hasn't always been. And so I sort of want to introduce the context of that and the conflict. And I'd like to start with sort of a quote from my research. And this was with a former rebel commander. It was taken in Pankisi Gorge and Duisi village. And I think it's a nice way to sort of begin the conversation. All right, so Chechens are not people who think of their stomachs in their pockets. And this is sort of a Chechen proverb that means you don't just think about your immediate needs or your material needs, right? So we're not a people who think of our stomachs in our pockets. This is a long fight. I like the movie Braveheart. Right? Why did William Wallace fight? He fought against injustice. And when he began, the people treated him badly, but he was silent. And when they killed his wife, he was a terrorist. This is Chechnya. Chechnya is small. Every family has lost so much. Every single one. We have lost so much. I have lost so much. And we were silent. I had this dream when I was a child that I used to see the packs of dogs running around the city, and I dreamed that I would one day find an island somewhere where I would take them and feed them. I would take care of them. And now the roles are changed. Now I wish I could do that for my people, but there is no island. There is nowhere that is safe. And this is why I fought, and this is why I will fight again. The Russians began this war, but we will end it. We must end it. There is no choice. There is only one William Wallace, but in Chechnya, we have many, many William Wallaces. Wallace fought and died for his freedom and independence. Chechens have died for their freedom and independence too. In the future, Chechnya will be free. So, let me also just say to the side, I've seen Braveheart now more than any other movie in watching it with the Chechens. But let's talk about Chechnya. So Chechnya, a small, landlocked, mountainous republic, about 5,000 square miles, roughly the size of Connecticut, located between the Black and Caspian Seas. along the northern edge of the North Caucasus Mountains. And for folks who have been there, I mean, these are really majestic, the highest peaks in Europe, very, very rugged terrain. And, going back to the 1700s when the Russians under Catherine the Great start to make their incursions south, looking for warm water ports on the Black Sea, they run up against the Chechens. And what you have is sort of this immediate contestation, and it becomes sort of baked into the psyches, into the cultures of both people. As the wars sort of evolve, you start to see, from the Russian side, people like Pushkin and Lermontov and Tolstoy, right, who served as young cavalry and artillery officers, writing about the Chechens, writing about this conflict. And from the Chechen side, you see it as well. And I think, again, I want to just say this in the beginning, because I think it really helps explain some of the story. Folks have, heard or read Solzhenitsyn, what he said about the Chechens, Gulag Archipelago, right, the one nation that wouldn't bow. Tolstoy and Haji Marat talking about, how the Chechens loathe the Russians for their senseless cruelty. But the Chechens as well, over time, have developed this. And again, I'll read you just a quick quote from a Chechen woman. Every Chechen man is programmed to be a warrior. We have a tradition. When a baby turns 1, we give him a knife and a piece of bread. If the baby grabs the knife, he is a warrior, and we will raise him as such. Every Chechen mother raises her son to be a fighter, a warrior, a brave man. And here's one of our lullabies. You are the son of your father, a father who was killed by a Russian. And by singing you this song, I am teaching you to avenge your father. And if you don't avenge your father, the same bullet that killed him should kill you. If that happens, I will be a very happy and proud mother by showing you the right path, by teaching you our way. And I'm putting around your neck a pendant, which is the bullet that killed your father. And again, I just want to sort of kind of begin the talk in that way so that we can understand some of these later dynamics when it comes to what we see in Syria, what we see in Ukraine, right? Understanding this sort of context. Now, going back to sort of the history, it has not always been confrontational. I know the Chechens, a lot of them will say, it's been 400 years of war and struggle, but of course there has been peaceful coexistence as well. But, after the 1800s, and you have this, the Murid Wars, the Great Caucasian Wars, however you'd like to describe them, you start to have this sort of coexistence, but you also have persistence rebellion. And this happens throughout the 19th and the 20th centuries. Now, moving into the 20th century, one of the real sort of seminal moments for the Chechens occurred in 1944, February 23rd. And this was the deportations. And some folks may have heard of these. But essentially, the premise was that Stalin and the Soviets were very afraid of the encroaching German armies, and that the Chechens, given this history, would link up with the Germans, and that this would be a real problem, right? The Germans are trying to move south to get to the oil fields in the Caucasus. And so one night, they launched this operation, and they round up, scores of people, deport essentially the entire population. Those who were too sick or too elderly to move were executed, burned in barns. The journey itself, right, on these train cars, sort of deported to the frozen steppes of Kazakhstan, scores are killed. And to this day, when I was living with the Chechens, certain communities would have a day of remembrance. And in certain families, if you had a child who was born on that day, they did not celebrate a birthday because they were seen as having a living reminder. And this becomes important too because they stayed in sort of exile until the 60s. Khrushchev, the sort of de-Stalinization, the thaw, they allow them back to go to their homes. Of course, they come to their homes and they find that their homes are now occupied by Russians and other ethnicities, and they are sort of marginalized. But as we move forward to the 90s, right, those young children who came back home, now they're adults. And as the Soviet Union starts to fall apart, as all of the 15, republics start to declare their independence, so does Chechnya. And at the time, a Air Force general, flamboyant, man named Dzhokhar Dudayev, he was the only Chechen general. He was in the Air Force. He commanded strategic bombers. But he came home, he gave a talk, and suddenly he was elected the leader, and Chechnya declares their independence. Now, from 1991 to 1993, domestic political squabbles in Russia and Moscow sort of keep Chechnya on the back burner. But at a certain point, they realize that Chechnya is kind of out of control, right, for them. and from Moscow. And so they decide, and this, this has sort of been documented. It sounds sort of fantastical, but at sort of a birthday party, copious amounts of vodka, they make the decision with the Minister of Defense, and they say, we're going to, sort of launch this small war abroad to raise popularity, to solidify the regime, something that they did in 1905. And so they launched this war. And in doing so, and again, I can go into the particulars in Q&A, but essentially, the Russians launched this war, and they use conscripts. They don't have maps. Their radios don't work. It's very much like what you see in parts of contemporary Ukraine with the invasion. And the Chechens were ready. And the amount of destruction, the amount of loss of life on both sides was terrific. Essentially, though, Russia is large. Chechnya is small, right? It's actually, I didn't say this earlier, but it is the largest sort of ethnic group of the North Caucasus at 1.5 million people, but that's minuscule compared to Russia and the military resources that Russia can bring to bear. And so the Chechens are putting up this fight, and they're sort of slowly being driven back. And the other thing to note about Chechnya is, or sort of looks like a hand, is in the north, it sort of is flat plains, but in the south is where you start to get into these mountains. And so what happens is, right as sort of it seems like maybe the Chechens, the Chechen resistance, fighting for national independence, right as it seems like they are going to sort of lose, one of the warlords named Shamil Basayev, he launches this daring raid into Russia at a town called Budynovsk, and he seizes a hospital, and he takes these hostages, and the Russians try this hostage rescue, and it goes very badly, and this becomes the sort of the instigation for peace talks. And so and shortly thereafter too, the Chechens launched a counteroffensive and actually took back a lot of Grozny. And so those two events lead the Russians to come to the negotiating table, and they agree the Passagirt Accords to sort of give Chechnya de facto independence for 5 years and to revisit it. Well, what happens during that time is that Chechnya never had a history of sort of princes or kings or hierarchical governance, right? Sort of radical egalitarianism, they call it, sort of, right? It's clan dynamics. And these clans start to fight, and the warlords start to fight, right? Because they've got their own little sort of resources, they've got their own fiefdoms carved out. And it is very difficult when an elected, and the only free, fair, internationally approved election, Aslam Maskadov comes to power in 1997. He's a moderate. He's also a former Soviet colonel in the artillery, but he's unable to sort of bring these factions together, and he's very afraid of a civil war, and so he makes all these sort of accommodations. As all of that is happening, there's all sorts of crime and kidnapping, and so Chechnya becomes essentially this lawless place. Well, the big difference is that Vladimir Putin comes to power, right? And he is sort of the antithesis of Yeltsin, right? He's sober, he's serious, he's still wearing his shirt at this time, but he's this guy who's going to come and he's going to restore Russian greatness. And so he prosecutes a new war, and this war is very different. This time, they realized that one of the things that really hurt the Russian side was that they did not control the narrative. They didn't control the messaging. And so you had, Russian officers or Russian politicians would say in the first war, oh, nothing happened today, and then a free independent media as well at the time would sort of juxtapose that with, well, actually in Grozny today, here were, Russian sorties and bombs and stuff like that. And so the Russians learned to control the media. They learned to sanitize the language because domestic opposition to the first Russo-Chechen War was very, very strong. So the Russian army is nuts, right? The Russian army is working that day. They're conducting these zachistskis, right? These cleaning operations, which are really, really brutal affairs, surround the village, round up all the men from 12 to 70, they put them into filtration camps. And in these filtration camps, I mean, the most horrific torture that you can imagine. And I detail this in my book, but it's really, really just the worst things that you could sort of consider. So they control the message, they control sort of the populations. They attack the Republic, not in 3 sort of pincer movements like the first time, but they sort of attack it all at once. And the Chechens this time, the resistance, they'll tell you they kind of got it wrong. They thought that they would be able to sort of replicate what worked for them during the first war, but it didn't. And so very famously, a lot of them were surrounded in Grozny. And this, I've heard different stories about how true this is or not. Supposedly, and corruption, of course, is endemic through both wars, right? A lot of the weapons that the Chechens get are sold by the Russian soldiers themselves. Supposedly, some of the Chechen resistance, they make a deal with the Russians. Hey, there's actually an escape route out of Grozny. And so this is some of really the top commanders from the resistance. Well, what happened was there wasn't really a corridor out. It was a minefield, and it was an ambush by some Russian paratroopers. And, you know, again, I have met several people who were there that night, and it's just tremendous what they went through. I mean, some of them just volunteered to run straight ahead and to clear a path. Shamil Basayev, who I mentioned earlier, lost his leg. But that's a part of the story, right? How the Russians prosecute this war. And another third part of how they sort of do it differently is this idea about Chechenization. Because of the fractious nature of Chechen society, because of, we'll talk about later, the sort of the growing role of a different strand of Islam. Chechens were predominantly Sufi, but this sort of strand of Salafism or Wahhabism from outside. There's a certain faction, right, the Benoit clan, particularly with Ahmed Kadyrov, who was a rebel who was the head religious leader for the resistance. He switches sides, and that has all sort of cascading effects. The last thing to say about what the Russians were able to do was this idea about collective punishment as well. Realizing if you can't get the rebels, then you can target their families somehow. And so all of this has this effect. And at the same time, just talking about what the US did, in the first Russo-Chechen War, the United States made the deal that it was far more dangerous to let Russia go down a perilous path if Yeltsin were to fall. And so Bill Clinton famously compared Yeltsin to Abraham Lincoln, trying to keep his country together. Well, fast forward to the second Russo-Chechen War, and after 9/11, the first foreign leader to call President Bush was Vladimir Putin. And Bush had run on a campaign, people forget this, actually talking about, hey, Putin, you need to adhere to human rights abuses in Chechnya. Well, now the game has changed. And even in the US press then, what we see is that the Chechens who were freedom fighters are now terrorists. And again, as an aside, my book is full of quotes with Chechens just really abhorring that. Stop calling us terrorists. But that's what happens on the Russian side. Now, from the rebel side, again, they are sort of on their heels. They're running, they're sort of running back to their mountain bases. They're trying to sort of, trying to adjust to what's happening, and they're not ready. And so what happens is they devise their own sort of adaptive strategies. And what these are essentially are spread the conflict. This is something that they've done, as we said, right, in the 1700s, the 1800s, the 1900s. They spread the conflict to the surrounding republics. They start to target civilians, something that becomes extremely sort of controversial among the rebels. You actually see a split over targeting civilians, suicide bombings, taking the war to Moscow proper, attacks on the school in Beslan, attack on the theater in Dubrovka in Moscow. And then you start to see these new political objectives. And I know we'll touch upon this a little later, but the idea was no longer was it a fight for Chechen independence, it was a fight for an Islamic caliphate in the region, right? An Emirate Kafkaz, a Caucasus emirate. And later that would even morph into the Islamic State. And I know we'll talk about that more. But again, just sort of talking about how the insurgency evolved is an important part of the story. The last thing I'll say on this is, over time, as the conflict spreads throughout the North Caucasus, it starts to attract more people. The euphemism becomes no longer did my son go to the mountains, it's you go to the forest, right? Almost implying sort of in a geographic sense, right, the spread of the conflict. No longer was it young rural males, it was doctors, lawyers, engineers, the sons of political elites, their Olympic athletes are all joining the insurgency. The ranks swell, violence swells across the region, particularly in places like Dagestan. And what you see though is that as the ranks of the insurgents swell, the Russians start to take advantage of that by infiltrating these groups. And that to me was one of the most consequential things that they did. They infiltrated these groups with spies and informers. Those informers were able to sort of, to tell the Russians where they were. Of course, having a bunch of formal rebels under Kadyrov fighting also, right? They know the tactics, they know the hideouts. And so that really starts to degrade the Chechen resistance. The same thing happens in the build-up to the Sochi Olympics, when you start to see a real upsurge in Russian security actions, and then you have the war in Syria, right? Which Syria becomes the easy jihad, but it also becomes a way to fight. So I'll sort of stop there, and we can move to the next part, but there's more to the story,
Let's
for sure.
turn back. So you mentioned this, and this trend in the Second Russo-Chechen War. You've described it before the First Russo-Chechen War, that kind of the Chechens win the war, but they lose the peace. And then, as you described, you see the Putin regime use the kind of natural fractiousness, the kind of, characterized by kind of the landscape of Chechnya, these ravines, these valleys, and the existing clan politics, and you see how they use that, but also the language of kind of national security and securitization, the border checkpoints, the cleansing stations, the infiltration, implying a turn to counter insurgency. So do you think that securitization kind of characterizes the kind of Russian treatment of Chechnya and even after the Second Russo-Chechen War, because they kind of turn Chechnya itself into a kind of prison?
Yeah, I think that is a fair description, and within that, it's very interesting because, right, in the U.S. context, in the Western context, if you talk about counterinsurgency, you talk about it in terms of population-centric, right? So protect the population so that they feel secure enough to give you information on the insurgents, and then you engender that by providing security, providing sort of services and material goods. The Russians did engage in a form of counterinsurgency mixed with sort of counterterrorism. Their counterinsurgency, which is called enemy-centric or sort of autocratic, and that is essentially, again, this idea of directly targeting the population. So the population still plays a central role, but it now is the target to be attacked, because if you can't get the rebels, this is the best way. And there's a lot of very interesting work, my own and a few others, on this idea about what caused some of these defections, and it was Russian tactics. And what they tried to do in sort of these approaches, what's interesting additionally, is that this is what they tried to do beyond Chechnya. So they tried to do it in Dagestan, right? Get local elites who are loyal to you, and build up the security forces, directly target the population, and that has sort of been their MO there.
Yeah, and thinking back to kind of counterinsurgencies in Afghanistan, and you brought up that wonderful kind of chilling lullaby. Was there a sense in the Second Russo-Chechen War that kind of the new generation of Chechen fighters that you see, and we'll move right into kind of Syria and Ukraine and the expanded conflict, the kind of expanded struggle? Is it kind of the you kill one, what the Russian regime would call terrorist, and you've now created three with all of his sons and cousins and things that kind of you have this domino effect of you've now, because as you described, there was a turn from kind of the rural kind of disempowered, disenfranchised youth to then you saw doctors and engineers, and as to touch upon a contemporary thing, a very common thing that's said about Gaza is kind of the loss of a father figure or a cousin or an uncle is a driving force to a turn to political violence.
Yeah, and let me use this to sort of kind of tee up some of the other things that we're going to talk about. So the role of reciprocal violence in Chechen culture. Now, right, I totally accept and appreciate, right, cultures are constructs, and right, we have to be very cognizant of avoiding sweeping generalizations, but there is a significant portion of the Chechen population that perceives that they have this sort of, right, and they have in the past, but this culture of reciprocal violence. And what this has traditionally been is, directed against the perpetrator who has attacked you and things like that. It plays a very interesting role right now. One of the ways that it's playing an interesting role is that, if you think about, right, this, the sort of, right, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that's just not about reciprocity, it's about proportionality. No more than an eye for an eye, no more than a tooth for a tooth. Well, in speaking with Chechen rebels, what has happened to this sort of understanding, to this sort of the impacts, the unintended consequences of using these types of techniques in this environment, is that one, the Chechens, they don't know who was in that plane that dropped a bomb on their village, right? And a strict adherence to this blood code, and that, you know, you got to get that one person, but they can't. And so there's been a transferability now, right? If you can't get that person, then any other Russian will do. And for some of the rebels that I spoke with, it doesn't even have to be a serviceman, right? The Russian people, they support these soldiers, and so they are a legitimate target. So that's one part of it. The other part is about proportionality. And I'll just say there was one Chechen rebel leader I met. His name was the Tiger. He had lost his entire family. He was killed after I met him. I met him in Pankisi. But he said, you know, I will kill as many Russians as I can, right, because they killed my family. Now, the other thing about this blood feud is it was never meant to sort of apply to outsiders, right? It was meant, when you don't have an overarching government, I mean, right, think back to your Hobbes and stuff like that. When you don't have an overarching government, what keeps the peace? What keeps the equilibrium? It's this fear of blood feud. And it's one of the things that Maskhadov was so concerned about. It's why when sort of people like Basayev and others are sort of starting to, right, sort of challenge him, starting to align with sort of exogenous or external foreign Islamic groups, he's so concerned about unleashing this blood feud. But this is part of the story. The other part of the story that's very interesting and will come up later, I'm confident, is that Kadyrov has weaponized this in a way that is just, I mean, it's horrible, it's brutal, it's evil, but it's effective. And if we talk about post-Kadyrov, this is a central challenge for who succeeds him. But I kind of watched this happen in real time, and I wasn't really sure what I was seeing, but I was meeting with a bunch of people who were former rebels who had been captured by the Kadyrov forces. And what they said was, after being tortured, after their friends and compatriots were summarily executed, they were sort of mock executions, again, all these sort of horrific things. They were given a choice. You can be out, you know, take you out back and shoot you right now, or you could join us. And so what they would do is they would sometimes give them weapons, they'd drive them up into the mountains and say, you know, start walking east, and if you come across the rebels, you know, shoot them. And the other part of what they would do then is, as these men were sort of making their way back to the base, and you know, and I would ask them, like, why don't you just run away? And it was like this idea, like, well, they'll kill our families right out. As they were making their way back, other folks like the Kadyrovs would go to these villages and say, you know, so say you were one of these gentlemen, right? You're a rebel fighter, and I'm Kadyrov, and I capture you, and I torture you, and then I send you out. Well, as you're out there walking in the woods, what I do is I go to the village where you used to operate, and I say, you know, Nicholas has been very helpful in the operation to kill some of these rebels. He's helping us right now. So just, you better watch out. That whisper campaign, what that does is it locks you in. Now, because you sort of activated this blood feud against you, you need me for protection. Now, the same thing has worked in across Chechen society for Kadyrov. And here it's about patronage, it's about access to resources, access to jobs. You know, that he's the only game in town. And so you then have to, right, sort of bind yourself to him for security, whether that's physical security or just the idea about livelihoods.
So we've seen, maybe this is the idea that there's kind of two Chechnyas, that there's the Kadyrov, I mean, I think you can absolutely characterize it as kind of a mafia state that's you know, centered in Chechnya and Grozny, that's kind of been reconstructed with oil money. But then there's this second Chechnya that exists outside, and I think we mentioned it a little earlier, the kind of turn to a larger struggle. And I know that you've had some experience talking to communities outside of Chechnya. Let's talk a little bit about first Syria, which obviously starts about 5 years after the kind of official end of the Second Russo-Chechen War, and then obviously Ukraine, which starts around the same time. What's the generational struggle that's being fought here?
Yeah. So this is a really fascinating period within the context of sort of the Second Russo-Chechen War. And you know, on the books, right, it goes from 1999 to 2009, but it extends much further. It really extends up to about 2014 and the Sochi Olympics, even though there are remnants after. But one of the things, when I described sort of the differences between the First and the Second Russo-Chechen Wars, one of the other consequences of how Putin prosecuted the war, how Kadyrov and this kin targeting, was you had really unprecedented refugee flows. And these Chechens, fled in multiple directions. Some went through the mountains to Georgia, ending up in the Pankisi Gorge, where there were sort of co-ethnics called Kists. These were Chechens who had come across a couple hundred years ago, intermarried with Georgians. We'll talk about them more in a moment. Some went through Dagestan to Azerbaijan. Others went through the smuggling routes to get to Europe. And in doing so, right, with them traveled the politics, with them traveled a lot of the fighters who were wounded and who were being targeted. And that was one of the interesting things too. I tried to collect demographic data, and part of it is a bias because, Chechnya is a patriarchal society, and so a lot of my contacts were men. But overall, there was confirmation that a lot of the refugees actually were young men. And so anyway, what happens is, right, things start to, let me say it like this. For those people that wanted to continue the struggle, when they got better, it was very difficult for them to get back home. Again, these mountains, if folks have been there, the routes to get from Georgia, they're seasonal. It's difficult to get across. You can do it in ones and twos. Very famously, the group that I was with, Hamzat Galayev, the Black Angel, he was killed trying to cross over these mountains because of all the border patrols in the area. So it's difficult to get back. There are smuggling routes through Ukraine back then, I'm sure still today, but those are ones and twos. So it was very difficult to get back home. And then when you got back home, again, another consequence was the Chechen people, the population supporting the rebels, I guess back to the counterinsurgency quickly, they provided them with everything, but it became almost untenable for them to do that. So it was very difficult for them to survive. And so what happens is you see this sort of first generation of Chechen fighters. When Syria comes, this is a chance to fight back against Russia. And so this is, again, I'll avoid some of the names and things like that, but these are folks who were sort of in their later 20s, 30s, and 40s, veterans of the Second Russo-Chechen War who see a chance to go back and fight. Now, if you want, I can talk more about motivations. Someone that I knew very well, a guy named Wacha Bugayev, he was one of Galayev's top guys. He had been wounded. He was later killed in Syria, but right before that, he's this guy who's this Chechen rebel, and he's living in this sort of beautiful bucolic valley. He's married, he's got 3 kids, but he was bored out of his mind. And so Syria becomes not just a chance to sort of fight back against Russia, it's a sense of adventure, right? It's a chance to make money. It's a chance to do all of these different things. But what you see, and at the same time in Ukraine, you see other Chechens, again, predominantly veterans from the Second Russo-Chechen War, going and forming these battalions, the Dzhokhar Dudayev Battalion. Sheikh Mansour, one of the original leaders of the Chechen resistance in the 1700s, right? They formed these pro-Kiev battalions, and they're fighting in Ukraine early on, right, in the east. But then you see, as you said, this generational thing. Well, what happens is the younger generation, right? These kids who grew up in the wars, who are absolutely like lionizing their older brothers and their fathers. Well, they see this as their chance. And again, one story, Hamzat Galayev I mentioned, his son, Rustam, who I knew as sort of an awkward teenager, he had big shoes. And I've got quotes where the people say this, like, they felt bad for Rustam to live up to such a famous father. I have no doubt that that's one of the reasons that he went to Syria and was one of the first Chechens who was killed. Anyway, the second generation, they want to fight, but here's what happens. While that first generation goes, they start to form their own groups, right? Ajnad al-Kaz, they're unaligned. They're not aligned with like Al-Nusra Front, which, I know it's had like a dozen names, but they're not aligned with any type of Al-Qaeda group. They're definitely not aligned with the Islamic State group. And again, I have just tons of interview data where the Chechens are like, ISIS, that's not us. That's not us. Look at these other guys who are fighting for these non-aligned groups, right? Look, they fly our flag the highest. He does it with a wink, right? He's giving us a clue that he's fighting for the real cause. Well, the younger generation, they do, right? They are more religious and in a way that is less traditional. And this is, again, this sort of confessional sectarian dynamic plays out across the Chechen community. But these are the folks who started to fight for ISIS. And just as a quick aside on that too, within the diaspora, these Chechens, they go to all these different places. In my own research, I was interested in understanding under what conditions do displaced people support militant violence. We know that there's a relationship, right, between refugee camps, those are particular mechanisms between diasporas. Having done this for 20 years, I was there for, observing firsthand the evolution of the Chechen refugee community into the Chechen diaspora. And every place that I went to see if there was variance, right, in how they, in whether they supported violence, every place was different. The grievances they faced were different, right? Security here, economic problems there. The living conditions were different, right? The political objectives that they wanted were different. Their views on violence were different. And it's a very interesting story. Again, these are the people that came from the same place, left at the same time for the same reason. They go to different areas, and maybe there's a selection effect, but not one that's particularly robust. Meaning, like you and I are both pro-North Caucasus, and so we decided to go to Belgium together. But all of this variance happens, and so there's all this tension then. All of the political struggles that happen come over to the diaspora. And so what I was reminded of is this one interview I had with a woman, and her son was there. He insisted, her son was a self-professed Wahhabist, and he insisted on being in the interview. And in the interview, this woman, she kept talking about how great Kadyrov was. Like, look, he's rebuilt Grozny. Look, everybody gets a car. And this kid is like, what, Mom? He's a brutal murderer. He's killing all those people. And she just keeps going and going. And finally, he gets so upset, he leaves the room. And then she leans over and winks. She's like, I have to give him a hard time. He's a Wahhabist, right? And but again, there's an entire story about these dynamics at play in the diaspora. And when it comes to sort of, again, the politics of it and the role of Kadyrov, I'll say one other thing about the Chechens, and again, this ties in. When we think about political objectives, we think about them on a continuum, right? And so if we apply that to the Chechen case, we can say, what should Chechnya be if you ask them? Chechnya should be a part of Russia, it should be independent, you would think it should be part of a Caucasus emirate, or it should be part of the Islamic State, right, this global caliphate. Those seem to be on a continuum for maybe, if we think about it, maybe more moderate to more maximal goals. But here's the thing, 92% of the people in my work, when they talked about those maximal goals, right, when they talked about an North Caucasus, that was not the ends. That wasn't what they were fighting for. That was the means through which they achieve what they really want, which is independence. And that is the same thing for some of the folks that supported the Islamic State, right? Because what they'll say very explicitly, Chechnya, we're too small, we're too isolated, we can't do it on our own, we need to join together with our fellow brothers in the North Caucasus, something they've done in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, 20th century. And so that is a very important part of the story there. The other thing I can sort of talk to is this idea about two Chechnyas. What other folks will sort of point out, it's very interesting. Kadyrov is one of Putin's most loyal, sort of, right?
His TikTok videos attest to it. He loves sending TikToks to.
That's right. And part of this is because Kadyrov knows that his entire future is tied to Putin. And there's a great quote. A friend of mine who used to work for Memorial, she did an interview with Kadyrov, and she talked about in the early days how he knows how the insecurities. And he would say, like, the only person I can talk to is my dog. And his dog died. And he said, it's because I filled him with so much grief, right? So Kadyrov knows he's in a very precarious position. But if you look at Chechnya today, it has, essentially a private army with the most advanced, special forces and equipment and all these types of things. They are absolutely outside of the Russian constitutional law framework. If you were to say, like, what does Chechen independence look like, or could look like, if you took a picture of Chechnya, it's like, how is that not it? And in doing so, there is this contestation, as you said, for the two Chechnyas. Just this week, they announced, so some of the Kadyrov forces, right, the sort of the militias that became formalized in the Russian National Guard, they announced the formation of two new battalions, one of which is the Sheikh Mansour, right? So they are playing this, right? He very much realizes it, and it's a great messaging piece. Why do you want to go fight for the rebels? Look, we have Sharia right here, right? We have independence. We have all these things. So that's a part of it. The last thing I'll sort of say here is about the diaspora. When you look at sort of their views on violence, it's a very complex story. You know, I didn't pose, when I asked about this, I didn't pose sort of like, you know, hypotheticals. I asked about a few concrete attacks and used those as sort of touchstones to try to sort of understand, you know, different types of support. But what you see in the motivations, right, a lot of it was sort of very strategic, very instrumental. Like the people who were against it were like, it doesn't work, it's going to invite more violence against us, it gives us a bad reputation. The people who supported it did so, you know, one, because they felt like they had no choice, right? Russia's big, they have planes and tanks, and we have nothing. You know, this idea about revenge is another part of the story. But the other side of it is like, something that occurred to me not too long ago was like, you know, when we think about war and peace, we think of, not Tolstoy's book, but just the general conditions of war and peace. Although maybe the book too, why not? But when we think about that, right, we treat it as a dyad, we treat it as sort of, right, like dichotomous, you're either here or you're there. But when it comes to the Chechen population, you know, one of the reasons I'm calling this book manuscript is War Unending, because for many of the Chechens, you know, they're no longer subject to, you know, planes dropping bombs on them and Russian artillery shells, but they are still subject to insecurity, right? Kadyrov has spies in the diaspora. When I was there, there were extraordinary renditions. Two very famous cases. It was horrifying to sort of be a part of that. The family scrambling, you know, where was this one individual? They couldn't find him. Come to find out, they later found him, you know, killed on the side of the road in Chechnya, right? There's obvious signs of torture. And so there's this constant sort of insecurity, right? And Kadyrov is engendering that. All of the assassinations, right, that take place in the diaspora. On top of all of the sort of the other types of material sort of insecurity, do you have enough food? Can you pay for your, you know, your apartment or things like that? And then this existential threat. And that's where it also comes in, right? Again, you see it in Pankisi, the Council of the Elders, the Women's Council, the Sufi mosque being sort of challenged by, you know, these more elaborate mosques in Duisi and Omalo and Jokolo now would have external funding which attract the younger generation. It's this existential threat. And that too is important to understand what is happening in Syria and what is happening in Ukraine. Again, countless narratives in my work about how, you know, this is just preparing for the long fight. Our fight is against Russia. Our fight has to be against them, or we have to fight for freedom. We have to fight for independence. And I think that's why you can see some of these groups fighting and sort of even messaging the way that they message. And I don't know if you want to ask another question, or if you want me to sort of talk about the population's reaction to Ukraine modern?
Yeah, well, let's just touch a little bit on, we know kind of over the long history of diaspora and displacement, particularly in the late 20th and 21st centuries, that these are kind of breeding, the conditions that particularly religious and ethnic minorities face, even in Western Europe after the migrant crisis, that these are kind of places that breed a certain kind of resentment and breed a certain kind of disenfranchisement that makes ideologies like Wahhabism quite attractive. And when you kind of put that in tandem with this Chechen cultural affinity for kind of a lionization of sacrifice and martyrdom, in your experience dealing with these diaspora communities, did you find that kind of the more economically precarious, that was the people who were the younger generation was most willing to kind of turn towards a new?
Yeah, no, you know, not specifically. And I think, you know, that idea, I mean, we have learned so much in the last 20 years about, you know, quote unquote radicalization and how it works and things like that. And you know, with respect to how that played out in the North Caucasus, in Chechnya, a lot of times, you know, like in the Western context, we sort of think about this sort of sequencing. Like something happens, right? You're impoverished. You know, there's some trigger point, and then you go off and you become cognitively radicalized, and then you join a group, right? In the Caucasus, that's not how actually it worked, right? For a lot of these folks, maybe there was no opportunity, right? Because you weren't on the Kadyrov patronage sort of network, and so the insurgency, if it wins, right, that's a whole new social order, right? Maybe you've got a chance for upward mobility. That's one way. The other way is with the abuses, right? One of the things when I talked about the expanding sort of profile, demographics of rebel recruitment, you know, another thing is the rebels were very savvy, and they realized, like, oh, you know, you were beaten up by the police. If you're beaten up by the police, where do you go for justice? You don't go to the police. The rebels were like, come to us. We will help you get revenge. And of course, you know, maybe they put you on the video and say, here's Nicholas, our new recruit. Thank you for joining us. We're all wearing masks. Nicholas is not. And
That's
so
a
now,
good incentive to stay with the rebel group.
That's right. Yes, that's right. Thanks for coming up to the mountains. But what happens is, as you sort of spend every day with us, you start to, oh, okay, this is kind of what's happening. And so I don't really see that driver. What I really see is, again, the story, and it's a little bit different, right? It's a little bit different in every single place, so it's contextual. But for the most part, you know, again, that first generation, I really think it is, you know, this is their chance, you know, to get back home. Just even a quick aside on this, you know, a lot of times too, when you mentioned some of the prevailing wisdoms about recruitment and things like that, you know, also one of the prevailing wisdoms is that young men are more, right? There's all sorts of, you know, data to sort of support this, but young men are particularly, if you did a survey, right, the young men would be more likely to support violence. The other thing in my data shows that men 55 to 65 were the second highest group to support violence. As I get older, I understand that, right? You're a little grumpy, but you know, but it's really about too. These people have been through, right? These are the generation that grew up in the deportations. These are the people that lived through the two wars, and now they realized, you know, it's very unlikely that they're going to see their dreams, and so violence is the only way. But I don't really see that part of it. You know, the economic story. I see it about wanting to fight back against Russia. I see it as young men looking for adventure, and in some instances looking. You know, again, this was a big story in Pankisi with the Kists, right? The Chechens who had intermarried with Georgians. Some of them, you know, became very prominent in the Islamic State. Tarkan Batriashvili, Omar al-Shashani was his nom de guerre. Among the Chechen respondents, they would say, those are Georgians, those aren't real Chechens, right? They were kind of like, there was this inferiority complex. But anyway, some of those Kists that joined also joined. Again, I got some great quotes in here. I won't share them now. But they also went because, you know, they wanted adventure. They wanted, you know, a car and a swimming pool with these sort of TikTok videos. But in several instances, a woman in Pankisi told me, she said, you know, there was one boy who went because he really wanted to marry this girl. And this girl said, if you go become a fighter in Syria, if you come back, I'll marry you. She wanted no part of this kid. She just wanted to get rid of him, and he went. And so, you know, again, the sort of the banality of motivations and violence, it's a very interesting story as well.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in talking about ideology and religion and all these big things, but you know, there's a more mundane aspect. And
That's right.
And maybe to turn towards, I mean, you've done so much work with the Chechen diaspora, and talk about their kind of relationship, maybe a little bit more with this kind of larger struggle, because of course, you know, the years are getting on, they're not, in many cases, they're not allowed, or it's very inadvisable for them to return. And now with the Ukraine war, I mean, it's literally physically impossible for, if they're living in the West, it's very difficult. So.
Yeah, and that is another part of it. You know, a lot of, again, this idea about exit, right? What's going on in the diaspora? This fear, this existential fear. You know, the kids aren't speaking Chechen; they're speaking Polish, or they're smoking. You know, the children just aren't behaving in a way that they want. You know, we can't even buy Chechen food or Chechen clothes here, and they want to go home, but that's right. Their very presence in not going home makes them a target of suspicion for the Kadyrovs. As much as the Kadyrovs forces, right, they're like, come back home, because the existence of a refugee or a diaspora community is a very visible indicator that things are not well at home. So there is that tension to come home, but yes, talking about what has happened since last year, the invasion of Ukraine, you know, once again, I kind of watched this happen in slow motion, but among the Chechen diaspora, when the Russians are starting to invade Ukraine, what you see is this sort of collective angst, right? The buildings look like the buildings in Grozny. The street signs look like the street signs in Grozny. The sort of like, 1960s Soviet architecture, right? Concrete on concrete. And so you see this collective angst and trauma. This is horrific, right? It's bringing back the horrors of the war. But then that narrative starts to change, right? And again, sometimes you watch these things just from like, a Telegram channel and you just sort of like click on something and then go down and read the chat or speak to people as well. And then just sort of like understand what's happening. But then that angst turns to anger. Where were our javelins, right? Where was our Western support? Where were the sanctions on Putin or Yeltsin, right? Where was that? And then that anger turned to sort of action, right? And here is where you start to get very explicit calls. I think it's time to renew the operation to overthrow the occupation of Chechnya, right? So among the diaspora, and there's all sorts of disparate competing political factions within the diaspora, but that's kind of where we're at. And I think, again, looking back and reflecting on my own sort of research, how this story began, thinking about sort of, right, like the different support for those political objectives and what it all really means, in some ways, a crooked line from a distance looks straight. For the Chechen struggle, we're sort of coming back around again. And in some ways, it's new, right? Because social media, the Chechens would say to me as well, like, oh my goodness, like if only we had cell phones, right? Like grainy VHS videos, like things would be different. So the technology is new, the interconnectedness is new, the political landscape is new, there's uncertainty, there's hope, like what happens if Kadyrov goes? He's in ill health. What happens when Putin leaves? Is that an opportunity? And in doing so, even some of the old ideas, we talked about religion. At one point in the 90s, the sort of, just for sort of a heuristic, the Islamists and the nationalists were sort of like two competing sort of, ideologies. And I remember you could go with some of the Dudayev folks in Baku, and you could, drink vodka and stuff like that. And then the other side of that would be prohibitive. But, there has been this fusion over time. And so now, you absolutely could get someone who wants, Chechen independence with religious forms of regime type, like Sharia or whatever you'd like to call it. And that seems new within a contemporary context, but it's really not. It's this idea going back to like Ghazavat, going back to Imam Shamil, the Dagestani leader that fought against, Tolstoy and Lermontov and Pushkin, going back to Sheikh Mansour, right? And so there's kind of this return. And so, yeah, for me, within sort of like how I've looked at this problem and sort of my experiences, it does feel like we're sort of, right, it's kind of new, but it's not. And maybe
that's a trend you see across the region. Ukraine talks about the years long history that they're defending. Russia itself, obviously the Putin regime relies on the 1945 victory. The kind of history itself has become malleable, has become a part of the battlefield itself. Yes. That you kind of see a return to these older forms, or these kind of calling back to older forms, because that gives a source of hope maybe when things are not going the way that maybe the resistance thought it would. But maybe to talk, you mentioned the kind of new struggle, and I just want to talk a little bit about this, the Sons of Ichkeria, and this kind of very, very new, well, maybe not so new, but new turn of kind of, we're fighting in Ukraine and this is our chance to pivot. What's kind of where is that coming from, and what does it look like?
Yeah. So Ichkeria, of course, is, it's a region in Chechnya, but it is the name of independent Chechnya, right? In the first root of Chechen Wars, like Chechen Republic of Ichkeria. And so what Nicholas is referring to is part of these groups that are sort of fighting in Ukraine, pro-Kiev groups. There's this other faction called the Sons of Ichkeria, and there's some political support for them. And again, they are very explicitly wanting, now we don't know how big they are or what capability they have, but they are wanting to bring the struggle back home. And again, I cannot help but reflect on what that would look like and what types of obstacles. For me, even assuming Kadyrov, when Kadyrov passes, again, there will be a struggle among some of his sort of inner circle. They'll have to agree to some sort of power sharing. but would the people rise up? And here's where, when it comes to that dimension, I still think right now, I don't see, just for a majority of the Chechen people, that they would be willing to sort of support that. That war is still so fresh. They would, they'll tell you, like, we lost our best. I mean, best of a generation. And so I don't know that the sort of the will of the general population is there for another war. Among the people that do have that will, well, a lot of them are fighting in Ukraine right now. And I would be surprised if, again, like there's one general, Rustam Ajiev, Abdul Khalim al-Shishani, he was with Ajnad al-Kawkaz in Syria, young, charismatic fighter, fought in the Second Russo-Chechen War, is now, one of these political factions. But there's all these videos of him fighting, and he's, I mentioned this to someone, I was like, wow, like, he exhibited like very poor fire discipline. They like they just shot more sort of rounds than they needed to, and they would. I used to watch a lot of videos. My wife Kim is here. She would complain about late nights. Like, what is that shooting? It's a Chechen video. They never would exhibit that type of behavior, and so for me, it's like, so they're clearly not worried about that, right? They're not worried about ammunition shortages, and so I would be surprised if those factions fighting in Ukraine were not stockpiling in some way, caches, thinking about taking the fight back home. So that becomes the next question, right, as you play it out. Like, Kadyrov goes, there's some sort of, right, contestation, or there's a crack, right? There's a crack in the regime. How many people, right, how many people do you need to sort of launch a rebellion? Because at some point, even if the population is reluctant because of the horrors that they've experienced, even if they're reluctant, at some point you kind of, right, the game changes. And you got to pick sides. Again, I think on the face of it, I don't expect that we are going to see a new Chechen war anytime soon. But what I would say again is that the calls for that are louder than they have been in a very long time. The confidence that they can get it done is more robust than it's been in a very long time.
Well, as the last 2 years have shown, if you make a prediction in our region, eventually you'll be proven wrong. So I won't ask any more predictions, but I will say thank you so much. It's been a wonderful time speaking to you. I think that this is so important to continue to think about Chechnya, especially in the context of kind of the more fraught geopolitical situation. To think back to a time when that was the conflict that was on everyone's mind, and to keep bringing it back, because the lessons are absolutely pertinent right now.
Yeah. And to end sort of to end with a greeting, Marsha Yochili, right? The Chechens, may you be free. You greet someone. So thank you very much, and thank you to the folks in the audience. Thank you to the center. I've really enjoyed the talk today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dennis. I think we have time for probably one or two questions.
Yeah, my question is, when is your book coming out?
That's my question as well. I had essentially completed the manuscript last year. The dynamics that are happening, that sort of collective, that angst to anger to action, I think that is just far too important to omit from a book. And so I'm trying to sort of get back and be able to sort of fill that part of it out. So I would say it'll probably, maybe 2 years, I would be hopeful. But yes, it's sort of, again, it's, just sort of one of those things. It's not just that life gets in the way of writing a book, it's that, as we've sort of discussed today, every time I sort of thought I was at a point where I could kind of tie it up, something new and interesting happened. And maybe that's my fault as, as a sort of prospective author, is not to just sort of, to tie it up at that point. But no, at this moment, I'm also, I'm very aware, and even preparing for the talk, I share with Nicholas some of the quotes that I have. And, my experience is sort of even being sort of an advocate for the Chechen people. One of the things early on that they were very upset about was, one, that everybody was calling them terrorists. They were very upset about that. And two, that the world didn't care about them. The world didn't hear their story. And that's really what a lot of my book is. It's their words, it's their story. And I feel a responsibility to get that out. So.
Thanks.
And was Chechnya its own entity in 1991 to 1993? And like, how did the world view Chechnya at that moment? And how was able to keep the fight against Russia for that long?
What was the last part of it?
Like, how did they keep the fight against Russia being kind of like that gray zone state?
Yeah, from 1991, I don't think that the world paid very much attention to Chechnya. I'm trying to go back. I mean, at the time you got, and that's what you were saying, really, even in the conferences, right, the Balkans dominated for a long time. Partly that was, academia and scholarship kind of catches up to a war. It's less so now with technology, but for a while that was sort of the case. And so the Balkans really dominated. It's just hard, right? I think I talked to you earlier, for my own research, I called it the 3 T's: time, trust, trauma, and security, right? Those are the things that I had to navigate to conduct a systematic research study. And so the world didn't really know very much about it. The world is sort of more concerned about NATO expansion, Germany reunification, political liberalization, economic liberalization in Russia. So Chechnya is just kind of left to its own devices in that time. And that's where, again, you see, to call it a failed state, maybe it's because it's not a state, right? It's not an independent entity. But it was a very difficult time there, I mean, things did not function in the way that you would expect them to function. Now, again, what happens early on is, yes, there was that invasion in December of 1994, but before that, again, something, right, sounds familiar to today, the Russians actually tried to send down, they tried to get a couple of, pro-Moscow Chechens, and they sent down some Russian servicemen. They sent them down there to try to overthrow Dudayev. They were captured, and the Chechens put them on camera, and they're like, "Well, you're Russian soldiers," and the Kremlin was like, "No, they're not ours." They had dog tags and everything like that. So they tried to do that first, and then there was the full-scale invasion. And again, there are any number of really good books and authors on this topic. But yeah, just the Russians just really prosecuted the war poorly. And again, personally, when it comes to contemporary Ukraine, I personally did not think that the Russians were going to invade full scale like they did. I just thought there was, why would they need to do it? But I said, if they do, I don't think it's going to be as easy as some people think, because I thought those sort of pathologies that manifest in the Russian military, in my sort of, kind of reading of it from through the Chechen lens, I think they still sort of exist. And again, for the Chechens, they just had a tenacity. They knew the home terrain, and all the little things, even at the tactical level. The Russians did not have a lot of Chechen speakers, and so the Chechens, they would speak on the radios in Chechen. The Russians didn't know what happened. The other thing is, especially in the first war, right, a lot of the fighters had just come out of the Soviet army. And so, I had many rebels tell me, they would do things. They would get on the radio and they'd tell the Russians, pretend to be like a Russian officer and say, hey, you need to get down to this block right now. It was an ambush. They would do things, get Russian soldiers to fire on one another. And so, yeah, it was just a very different story, that first war. The second war, again, that's where the rebels will say, we got it wrong. And they underestimated how Russia would fight. And even that, sort of Russia in the first war, they drove tanks down city streets with no infantry, right? This is not that I know anything about that, but it sort of like 101, that's not what you do. And so they were able to, other incidents, right? So the Chechens were able to sort of ambush those convoys. Other times they do things, this is a very famous, actually someone was prosecuted for this. There was a very famous Chechen foreign fighter named Kadyrov, and on the note of foreign fighters, maybe 100, maybe. That's my sense of how many, but they had an outsized influence. They would do things like you hit the first one, you hit the last one. Just they really took advantage of poor Russian tactics, but they overestimated sort of it's in the second war. Instead of trying to drive down the city streets, Russia would just level. They're here now. They've learned, the Russians. They would just level the urban environment. And so even when I was there in 2006, in Grozny, I mean, it was just flattened. It was destroyed. It looked like something from World War II. Sadly, it looks like something from Syria or Ukraine today.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that that's the first war that can kind of be said to be fought in the ruins of the Soviet Union. And now, of course, I mean, when I was reading up on this, I immediately thought of the Battle of Azovstal in Mariupol, where you kind of had this ghostly Soviet giant factory, and they're fighting amidst kind of the ruins of what the Soviet Union was trying to build. And I know that the Soviet Union was very active in the Caucasus, and I mean in Georgia, all of
Yes,
these wars
that's right.
that broke out on the periphery.
Unless somebody else has a question, I get to ask questions. What is the importance of Chechnya to Russia? Why is Russia so committed to keeping Chechnya beaten down?
Yeah, I mean, early in the 90s, there was always this question of like, why did Chechnya not go the route of Tatarstan? Tatarstan in the center of Russia, resource rich, a lot of the same sort of separatist musings were about at the same time. Russia made a deal with Tatarstan, gave it significant autonomy. And so there was always a question about that. You know, Chechnya, again, it's not very big. It's on the northern side of the mountains, which were a strategic, defense. If you talk about 200 years ago, right, like mountains, that's what if you're a great power, you want mountains on the borders, right? But it's the border itself is not. I mean, it's 5,000 square miles, but the border with where Chechnya actually abuts Georgia, it's not very long. And so if it's not geopolitical, it's something else. And I think early on, what's the relative causal weight of things? I think that history played a role. Again, there's the very famous, right, the Cossack lullaby, right, where, go to sleep, or the Chechen will cross the Terek with his knife and stab you. Like, it was a part of Russian culture, and part of, it shows up in Solzhenitsyn, it shows up in Tolstoy and Lermontov and Pushkin and all these other writers. I think that played a part of it. I think it was just the timing of it, right? Like, Yeltsin was facing opposition. This was a problem that the Minister of Defense, Grachev, convinced, like, hey, we can do this in 2 hours. That's what he famously said. Give me a group of paratroopers and we'll get this done in 2 hours. And so I think at first that's kind of what explains it, but then it becomes a different story, right? So if you ask that question, it's like, why does Chechnya matter in 1991, 1994, or why does it matter today or in 1999? It matters in 1999 because Putin comes to power and the Russian military was humiliated. And this was a chance to show the world and to show the domestic Russian constituents, we have a strong military and we are back. There was a punishment angle. There was a sort of reputational, a demonstration angle. And now I think it's just become, it's still for Putin, it has become sort of a success story, right? Like, and I know this is very complicated, but he was able to sort of rein it in. And so, and beyond that too, there's even some of the Chechens too, this kind of feasibility issue. Like, if Chechnya were like a full, like, give them a seat at the UN, what would that look like? Like, what is the economy? I mean, they're landlocked, and you basically have to go, northeast or west. You can't go south for trade. So I think that sort of in parts explains the answer to that.
Yeah, where would you say the diaspora is mostly congregated? In what country?
So numbers have always been very difficult to sort of collect. The big communities are, if we can trust them, because again, the other side of it too is a lot of times, there's all these sort of like legal regimes in Europe of where you can go, where you can stay. So a lot of times they would come through Belarus or Poland and they'd register, but that's not where they wanted to go. So they try to get to Germany or Belgium or things like that. But we do know that Turkey has had a large community for a long time. Austria has had a large community. Germany's community is growing. Belgium, but really Austria. France a little bit, but yeah, I'd say sort of Austria and then sort of Germany, Turkey, France is sort of like a second tier, and then you sort of get smatterings, some in America, some in Canada, some in the Scandinavian countries, maybe a handful in Spain or things like that. But when they, and again, and here's the other part of the story. I know a lot of times the media and others focus on the negative. Like, a lot of the Chechen diaspora, they are integrated. They, in some places it's hard for them to get jobs, and they live in really sort of squalid conditions. But in other places, doctors lawyers, engineers, politicians. It's the story of any diaspora. What makes them unique is the high proportion of that diaspora that goes to fight in other wars.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Dennis. Thank you so much for this.
Thank
Oh, did someone else have a question?
Oh. Yeah, I was gonna off camera tell you the two Chechen jokes. Okay.
I'll stop it right now.
They're not bad anyway, but